Started, everybody.
All right, now getting on Facebook.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gareth Evans. I'm the director of the Bellamy Museum of History and Design Arts, part of Preservation North Carolina. I am a ham because I'm wearing this ridiculous hat. It may not last for too terribly long, but it's very nice of you all to join us this afternoon. We're always very pleased to have Dr. Michaela Howells with us to talk about the anthropology and history behind mythology in many ways. I think we've done Victorian mourning and we did vampires last time. Of course, it's Halloween themed, but there is a lot of serious history and study behind it, which we love to dig into. A couple of things here. If you have questions as you go along, if you'll put them either in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom. You do not appear as guests on this webinar. You all stay in the background, but I can read all of that. And at the end, I'll ask Michaela the questions that you post. So please don't be shy about posting things as we go along, and we'll get to it with the Q&A. All that being said, you should be able to see the shared screen, I hope. If there's any technical issues during the course of this, also put that in the chat or in the chat would be helpful. And I'll see if I can help you out. Jen Fenninger is on this as well. She is managing the IT side of it. She's our new education director down at the Bellamy Museum. So having said all that, Dr. Michaela Howells is an associate professor of biological anthropology at UNC Wilmington. This year I read, this was cool. She won the YWCA Woman of Achievement, one of those awards for teaching and volunteer work to promote equity in education. So congratulations on that. That was lovely. She has a PhD in anthropology from Colorado and lots of specialties, which I'm sure she'll get to, but including medical anthropology, intergenerational stress, which was an interesting, it sounded fascinating, health education, human variation, among, as I say, quite a lot more. So that being said, I'm going to mute myself and try and be inconspicuous. And I will leave it to Dr. Howells. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for making it this afternoon. I know we have a lot on our plates right now, and the weather is gorgeous, so I'm thankful that you're here with me. Gareth, I love that you're going to try and be inconspicuous while you're wearing a fur-lined witch's cap. So, you know, good on you. Good on you. So, as we mentioned, I am, oh my goodness, I got all excited and okay, there we go. So as we mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. And I want to give you some grounding on what that means. So anthropology is the comparative studies of humans cross-culturally. I'm a biological anthropologist, which means that in particular, I look at how biology and culture intersects. And I'm really interested in the impacts of policy, bias, and inequality and inequity. And this is going to come out in this talk today as we're talking about some of the spaces that we see witches and understand witches. And as anthropologists, we work really closely with the community. So you might have seen me in other spaces doing other work. This is not my main focus, but it is one that I find particularly interesting. So I'm sure you can all, pardon me, I'm having problems moving forward here. All right, so we can think about all these witches in our head, all these different types of witches and places and you know, reflections of witches. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind, if you're near your chat, you could throw in your favorite witch, whether it be the scariest witch or your just favorite witch, the most badass witch, whichever witches speaks to you. I'd love to hear who comes to mind. That chat function there you can utilize, I think. So as you're thinking about all these different types of witches and all these different individuals through time, you know, we can start thinking about witches from these other avenues, these other perspectives and ways of doing things. So for instance, we're going to be focusing here using an anthropological framework. We're going to be using a historical framework. We're going to be using an epidemiological framework to explain some of people's interactions with what they call as being witches. Socioeconomic is going to play a really huge role in this. And really what this comes down to is who has the power? And then on the flip side, who does not have the power? Jen, I see that you love Sabrina. Yes. So we're thinking about these in these broad ways. So at the core of this, we're going to be thinking about, how we think about witches and power. And this idea, like you've heard this term, it's a witch hunt, right? It's a witch hunt. They're doing this because it's a witch hunt. And we actually see the use of a witch hunt used throughout time as a way of like framing your opponents, right? So more recently, so within the last like couple hundred years, we see it as a metaphor used to malign opponents. So this is a way of basically saying, oh, my opponent doesn't actually have any basis in what they're saying. They are just, putting random things out there. For instance, in the Civil War, Confederates would use a witch hunt to characterize Northerners and abolitionists in pushing back against the Union, or pushing back against the Confederacy. So we still hear it used by very powerful people in very powerful places as like anything that is being charged or held against them, that this is a witch hunt, that there can be no basis, that there's a baseless accusation, right? And I think the fact that we now recognize it as a baseless accusation, witch hunts, is really powerful in terms of how we think about this. This talk and this information. However, we know is that witch hunts were led by powerful people, not against powerful people. So the people we're going to be talking about today, many of them have more individual power, maybe power within their own families. But what we're going to see is that they're people who maybe challenge more systemic power and larger policy power and suffer the impacts from it. Okay, I have a couple more votes in here in terms of witches. I see Hocus Pocus witches, Glenda the Good Witch, right? Oh, Glenda, I should put her on there. I know I'm going to be spending the next few days thinking of witches that should be in there. Okay, so we're actually going to start our tour of witches with the Black Death. And what I do want to recognize in this is that we see witches globally. We see witches globally filling multiple roles. And that is something I'm very interested in. But I want to focus our talk in a little bit more here. We're going to focus more on the European witch hunts, and then also those particularly in the Northeast. So Salem witch trial and those kinds of things. So we're focusing in geographically, but recognizing that this is something that we see, occurring. We see witches occurring across culturally. All right, so come back in time with me, if you will, to about the 1300s. And we're going to be talking about bubonic plague. And this is going to tie into witches, I promise you. So for those of you who need a little recap on the bubonic plague, about 25 million people died, which is about a third of the population passed because of bubonic plague. So during this time period. This is not the only time the bubonic plague is swept through. And this is also, doesn't mean that bubonic plague is gone, right? We actually see it actively. People get bubonic plague in the States all the time. It's just that we can treat it now with antibiotics. This was established along trade routes into Europe and spread throughout Europe. So the symptoms of bubonic plague there's a mixture because there's different strains, much like we have multiple strains of COVID, right? So for some strains, you end up with purple splotches, which are called God's tokens, because once those showed up on you, God would be taking you back to heaven soon, is the framework on that. Apple-sized tumors on your neck potentially would grow. Chills, tremors, fever, right? This was a horrific disease to die from. Led to foul breath, which was caused by rotting from the inside out. And it did not kill softly, but it killed quickly. Now, here's my really late comment on warnings here. The warnings here are that there's going to be several distressing images, and we're going to be discussing violence, death, and some sexual components. Okay, so this baby, I want to be clear, this baby does not have bubonic plague. I'm including this image because these splotches look very similar to the God's tokens. And I think that it helps us remember that these were real people who were suffering real lives. Whereas when we see these images, these black and white sort of, 2D images, it's not as meaningful. We don't recognize it for who they are as people. So what we see is this just panic as you'd imagine, right? We have black X's are painted on people's doors. We have pestilence houses where people, once they start developing symptoms, are being stuffed through the windows and locked inside. We see husbands leaving wives and wives leaving husbands, and babies abandoned, and people looking down and recognizing that their baby is showing the first signs of the plague, and throwing their baby to the side and running, because recognizing that there's no turnaround from this disease. We see entire villages shut down. So in this panic, in this complete space of lack of ability to be able to do anything, we tend to respond poorly as humans. We tend to lash out and try to figure out any answer for anything. So keeping this in mind, thinking about what the space looked like at this time period, there's little to no sanitations. A large portion of the population would throw their food scraps and their excrement in the streets. I'm always a little surprised when you go to the Renaissance fair that people aren't still doing this as part of like reliving the experience. But so you have food scraps and excrement thrown in the streets. And of course, this is very exciting to vermin. And what we see is that we have vermin coming in. They carry fleas. The fleas carry the bubonic plague, the buboes, and this leads to what we call a zoonotic transmission. So this is a transmission of diseases between human and non-human animals and humans. So this, for my science nerds out there, my medical nerds, the interesting thing about bubonic plague is that the bacterium gets stuck in the flea's gut. And so basically it's kind of like a stomach stapling for fleas, because they never get full. They always feel hungry, but they never get full. And so they keep feeding, they keep hopping from individual to individual in order to try and fill their blood meal. Okay, so these are things to keep in mind. I have some very cute images of rats here because I want to remind you that rats are actually very social, very gentle, like animals. They are great parents. And they really get villainized throughout the whole bubonic plague story. Okay, so one of the, in an extraordinarily unfortunate story in terms of the emergence of Black Death, an extra layer of that is the anti-Semitism that emerges during this. Not emerges, it's enacted on during this time, I should say. So we see that Jewish individuals died at lower rates of the bubonic plague. They were blamed for poisoning the water, right? They were blamed for causing this. They were blamed for bringing this disease on. And in response, they were burnt at the stake. They were hung. They were burnt to death in buildings, locked in buildings and burnt down. Some were stuffed in wine barrels and thrown in rivers. Sometimes, when I discuss this with my students, I'll say, well, why would you do that? Right. And it's like, why wouldn't you just kill them if you wanted to kill them? And this was seen as a way of getting around that pesky, thou shalt not kill, because technically you're not killing them. You're just putting them in a wine barrel and then throwing them into the river. So I share this in that we're thinking about how groups are responding to different groups, the xenophobia that we see, the concern with different groups and their experiences. So I'm going to go ahead. Okay, so as we're keeping this in mind, we think about how populations of Christians and Jewish, they were kept pretty separate. They were living in separate parts of the city. So there might be some overlap, but fairly minor overlap. And what we see is that more died from persecution than plague. So this is something to keep in mind. So we think that more Jewish individuals died of persecution during the bubonic plague than the plague itself. Okay. So how does this tie into witches? So what we see is disparate ideologies, right? Which just take home means that they're living different lives, acting different ways, behaving in different ways. And I'm talking about like the, Christians, Jews, they have different ways of doing things. They do not live together. There's not a crossover, like I said. They share maybe some burial lines, but for the most part, we have these communities that are separate from each other. And this produces a natural quarantine between communities. Right? So if one community is doing something different, it might protect them from getting the plague. And in fact, this is what we see. We see with the Jewish population at this time that they had more advanced ideas of hygiene. So for instance, one of the things that was really common was they would sweep more. They'd be more active in terms of like sweeping and clearing out space. There's some indicators that they'd carry food scraps and bathroom waste out and put away from the house, as opposed to sort of in a ditch right in front of your house, or not even a ditch, it's just the road outside of your house, the mud outside of your house, right? So the idea of like taking your waste away from where you're living. So they swept more. They're more likely to keep cats. So they're more likely to, just as a part just of the way people were living, they're more likely to have cats. And cats, you can imagine, are awesome if you have rats around, because rats, again, are real smart. And not only do they smell where cats are and avoid where cats are, but we see differences in programming of their pups, which are the baby rats, and that they keep away from these regions with cats. So if you're keeping the rats away and all the other vermin away, you're also keeping the plague away. And what I'm hoping that you're seeing here is that these different just cultural traditions that emerged, and these differences in these different groups and this natural quarantine that's occurring led to differences in terms of who was getting the disease and who wasn't, who was more likely to get it. And with these pieces, our broom, our black kitty cat, you might be thinking like, okay, this comes back to our sort of stereotypical witch. And one of the things was one of the most powerful things I've learned on my path of trying to understand more about how we can think about these sort of darker topics through an anthropological lens, is learning about this image of your sort of stereotypical witch with your black pointy hat and broad brim and longer sleeves and the cat and the broom, that this is actually based off of Hasidic Jews. So this is similar to what Hasidic Jewish women would have been wearing at this time. And this idea of them somehow cursing communities comes from this. So it's something to roll around in your mind and think about as we're utilizing these images and these outlines and this way of understanding the world. And as we're thinking about how we perceive who the witch is and what a witch is. Okay, so we're going to continue on in Europe, but we're going to fast forward in time just a little bit. So we're going to move into the Great European Witch Hunt, which was as horrific as you can imagine. This spanned for hundreds of years, right? It spans Reformation to the 30-Year War. This is a huge period of turmoil in multiple ways, right? And this is within the Dark Ages, what we usually refer to this, right? Because that's how and part of this is how we're addressing our women, as it turns out. So in this time, there's no definitive numbers, but estimates suggest that we have about 40 to 100,000 people who were prosecuted or identified and prosecuted as witches during this time. So this is across Europe. This is just really an attempt to restructure much of Europe and ways of doing things. 80 to 85% of these individuals who are identified and prosecuted as witches were women. Up to 85%. Look at that. So you might have noticed this asterisk following 100,000. Well, I did a quick check with demographics in New Hanover County, which is where we are right now. And this is the approximate number of women in New Hanover County today. So as you're walking throughout New Hanover County, if you think of every single woman that you see as being one of those who is as persecuted, that's a strong estimate of how many women were persecuted throughout this witch hunt. That's powerful, especially as soon as we know that populations were much less dense at that time, and we had fewer in terms of just a general population. Okay, like globally, I mean. So let's talk a little bit about some proof of witches that emerged at this time. Accusations took all forms, but proof was much less common, right? And there's all these different ways, and I just want to share one in particular with you. So this is in 1589. This is in England. Alice Samuel was accused of witchcraft, and she was found guilty and executed with her husband and daughter. The legal team requested a check to make sure she didn't have any signs of being impacted by the devil on her, or rather, we should reframe that as find the signs that of marks of the devil on her, right? Because they're actively trying to defend their perspective. So a post-mortem was performed by a jailer and wife who together found this incontestable proof. And this proof was a devil's teat from which Lucifer sucks. So once you find a devil's teat, you know that you got a slam shut case there. She's already dead. Her husband's dead. Her daughter's dead. But now they have proof. So what is a devil's teat, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked that. So that's a little wordy. I'm going to read it out to you. Sorry. So this is the writing from the jailer. Remember, this is a married jailer man. This is a little lump of flesh in manner sticking out as if it had been a teat. So in nipple, right? It's another word for a nipple. It had been a teat to the length of 1/2 inch. So they were saying in this, they hesitated to disclose this because it was adjoining so secret a place, which was not decent to be seen. Not willing to conceal so strange a matter, and decently covering that privy place a little above which it grew, they made open show thereof unto diverse that stood by. So what the heck is all of this saying, right? This is saying is that they found the clitoris. This married man and his wife found the clitoris on this woman who had been murdered, and we're calling it the devil's teat. So a moment of silence for the people who are murdered, and a minute of silence for the wife of this man. Okay, so this is tied into the Great European Witch Hunt in general, is tied into misogyny, which let's unpack that a little bit of like how that ties in, what this looks like, because we have a time where we're very focused religiously on answering the world and understanding the world through religious perspectives. So this is, misogyny as it's understood in European tradition is firmly rooted in religious belief. And in this case, when we're talking about these particular groups, look to the book of Genesis, where this text was used to demonstrate that women were morally weak and subordinate, more likely to succumb to temptation. And they use Eve succumbing to the devil's temptation in Eden to indicate these things, say like, no, this is, women are at a much higher risk of having problems with the devil than any man is. And this is going to be really critical to take forward with us because, of course, those individuals, those Puritans who show up in the Northeast are the ones who are coming from these European traditions and these religious understandings and engagements with the world. Okay. So, oh, that's an interesting animation there. Okay. So, oh, there we go. All right, thank you. All right, so we've already talked through the book of Genesis. And what we see is that understanding the texts in this way, it entrenches misogyny within early modern European society. Women are secondary, women are weak, morally weak, they're subordinate. It's it's supporting all those components. And this becomes a catalyst for the persecution as women as witches throughout time. So if you've ever heard of like diabolical or the diabolic pack, this is a really important piece of this puzzle. So as they're discussing the diabolic pack, this is a pact that says that women would deny Jesus to worship the devil, right? So keeping in mind that not all religious traditions like worship Jesus or recognize Jesus. So if you were a woman who was of non-Christian faith, you were entering into this diabolic pack, right? And with this, these pacts with the devil enable people to sell themselves, enable women to sell their souls and physical bodies to Satan in return for his assistance in employing demons to accomplish magical deeds of all kind. Okay, so for shifting into the American Northeast, and majority of people have heard of like Salem witch trials. We're gonna talk about them a little bit, but there's actually, that was one example, one particularly well-documented example, really. I want you to remember that in the time that we're talking about with Puritans, and we're talking about the New England witch trials, this is also a time where we're actively enslaving African individuals, that we're actively destroying indigenous populations, right? And saying we as someone of European descent. And then we as America, or the beginnings of what would become America, right? That this is actively going on. And so I like to frame that ahead of time, because sometimes people will say like, I can't believe we did this, or how could we have said this or acted like this towards people and these poor women? And it's like, yes. And this is something that we definitely show a propensity for historically. So in the Puritan tradition, women held a precarious, mostly powerless position within the community. In a Puritan perspective, women should have babies and raise children and manage a household life and model a Christian subservience to their husbands. And like this should be their entire identity. So this is not taking away from anyone who that is their understanding and that is how they want to live their lives, right? But also recognizing that when you're in a system like that, and that is not necessarily how you want to live, there aren't any options. And in fact, there are major consequences for not following along with these consequences. So women outside of these roles become targets. And again, this ties directly back to this idea that women were more likely to be tempted by the devil, right? That they were weaker morally, that they were more likely to be tempted, that there's that diabolical pack, and that Satan was striding around getting women to sign their books to say, that they are that they will sign this pack. Which, side note, I kind of love, because it kind of sounds like Satan's going around getting people to sign his yearbook. That's what always pops into my mind. Okay, no yearbook for you, Satan. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can make you be accused as a witch. At home, feel free to play along and do a little checklist of how many of these things that you might be if you are someone who identifies as female. If you're too rich, these could be sinful gains, so a pact with the devil to gain unearned wealth. If you're too poor, it shows you have bad character, and that's also an issue because it enables you to be affected by the devil closer. Too many children, it could indicate a deal with the devil. Too few children, it's really suspicious. Too old, what we see is that the majority of convicted witches are over 40 years old, which is considered older at that time. Too employed, the majority of convicted witches were frequently healers, midwives, worked within some sort of space in terms of herbs or botanicals. and we're seen as problematic. Again, thinking about if you have your own control over your own future, your own things to trade, this becomes a challenge to others. To unmarried, we see that convicted witches are often widowed, which makes sense in terms of they have less protection and support, right? And then also, and this is something I'm not going into today, but I want to put in your brain, is that widowed women would still be holding on to their family's money, their family's estates, their family's businesses, even though they wouldn't be able to work them the same, right, because of the laws and rules. But that this would help hasten people being able to, I don't even want to say buy them out of these things, but to be able to take these things. If you're a witch, we can take out your family. We can go ahead and reclaim that business, land, whatnot, for other people. And I know you'll all be shocked to know that what we frequently see is that those ill-gotten gains are then handed over to people who are in leadership and benefit directly from these people being affected. Also, the accusers are, we see frequently throughout this time period, the accusers are effectively gifted these properties or these businesses as a way of like making up for what they've had to go through being attacked by these witches. Okay, keep that in mind. I'm not going to go into that more, but think about it. If you're too prideful, if you're unpleasant, if you're too confident, if you're determined, if you're opinionated, all of these are problems and all are reasons that women have been persecuted as being witches through time. So again, I hope you're doing your little check off at home. And also we're going to see too black. We're going to talk about an individual who that particularly pertains to in just a moment there. So we're thinking about who is powerless, who is able to push back and who can't. Okay. So the New England witch trials occurred most frequently. So again, they're happening before and they're happening a little bit after, but between 1638 and 1725. We see, again, just like we saw in Europe, that women vastly outnumber men of those accused and those executed. About 78% of the 344 alleged witches in New England were female. So remember, it was about 80 to 85% in Europe. So we're seeing those same numbers and those same patterns. I will say that those men who are held as witches or that are held up for witchcraft charges, they are frequently held up as, if you will, like a secondary charge, like they are affiliated in some way with someone who's being accused of a female who is identified as being a witch by the community. So whether it be their husband, their brother, their friend, basically standing up for these individuals also leads to your demise. So most witches are women because witch hunts were all about persecuting the powerless, right? This comes back to the idea of how we misuse the term witch hunt today, because these are powerless people who are being further persecuted. And in this persecution, it's telling a story to everybody else. It's telling a story to the rest of the community about way you should and should not be acting. What you should and should not be doing, how you should and should not be. I mean, that all the things that you are too much of everything, that's your great takeaway of, the ways that you're supposed to be acting, and how we have a judicial system that is enacting these differences and who is persecuting those differences as effectively what we think of as like a felony charge that would lead to your death. Okay, so let me shift into the Salem witch trials here. I'm not going to go super in depth in terms of the accusers here, but a little bit of framework helps, I think. So these are, with the Salem witch trials, what we see is mostly teenage girls start having a series of symptoms. And these symptoms include mania, barking like a dog, complaining of being bitten and pinched by unseen forces. And the doctor on the scene, the doctor comes and sees them and looks at what's going on with them and recognizes that this is witchcraft. They recognize that this is witchcraft, which again, doctors don't have a whole lot of tools at this point. And this fit squarely into cultural understanding, right? Because you're thinking about this whole idea of witches throughout Europe. If you have a chance to watch on the Bellamy Mansion, YouTube feed, that my discussion last year of vampires also ties into this, of the European traditions coming to the States and how that we react to that. So this is all happening in about 1692. And what we see is that 14 of the 19 people found guilty of and executed for witchcraft were women, which again, at this point should be no shocker to you, right? We're seeing this pattern over time. However, only one person confessed. Oops, excuse my animations there. So Tituba is an enslaved woman, or was an enslaved woman who was born in Barbados. Her then owner had moved up to New England, was a more recent member of this community. And she was accused of teaching witchcraft to local girls. Now, the way that it's talked about is the way that you might think like teenage girls interact with like Ouija boards or tarot cards or something like that. Really, one, they don't know how to really utilize them, but it's more just like a little like entertainment kind of thing, as opposed to it being anything really tied to the occult. There is great concern throughout the community that the devil was recruiting, which is a reoccurring theme that we see with, you want to go back to the diabolical pact, right? That it's not just you're taking this one woman and that she is becoming, going into a diabolical pact with the devil, but that they are recruiting others to join this pact. So the thing about them, about her being being the only person who confessed, we need to remember that this confession was almost certainly coerced, right? That this was someone who was extraordinarily marginalized, incredibly powerless in multiple ways, in intersecting ways, right? She's a enslaved person. She's a woman. She's very, very little power to start with, and she's at extraordinarily high risk. So this is, together what we're seeing is examples of a judicial system that escalated local grievances. So this is, mostly rural communities, these local grievances to capital offenses, and subjugated and targeted a subjugated minority. So, here we have an example of an enslaved woman, but also, other people who identified as witches during these trials included women who are impoverished, again, widowed women, right? Women who are not seen to sort of fit neatly in the expected boxes. Okay, so we've been talking about why these attacks were occurring on these witches, on these individuals who are identified as witches, and about the policy and the power associated with that, and that ties into that, and who has power and who doesn't. But let's talk about what might have been going on. Like, why are these girls acting like this? Is there a biological reason that they're acting like this? So it's can recognize that it was not witches, right? But are there other things that might be? Well, in the 1970s, there was a really interesting paper that came out that talked about ergonism. So ergot poisoning. You can see in the middle central image there that this is growing on rye in this example. And these are black pieces that come off. And ergot is not something that you want to eat. It's a type of mold, and it grows on contaminated rye. This is actually one of the ingredients to LSD. So this is going to impact the nervous system. It has some serious impacts on the nervous system. And there's actually two versions of it, one that causes more of the mania and more of like the sensations of being pinched and prodded, and another one that leads to gangrene. So it's an ugly thing to ingest. So in this article that was written and is published in, it's either Science or Nature, one of those, they tie in the fact that there was major crop failure in that previous season that required the Puritans to eat fresh rye. And fresh rye is more likely to have ergot in it. It's more likely to grow that ergot and be a higher risk food item to consume. And what's important about this is that even if you cook it, even if you put it in bread, even if you brew it, right, you're still going to have exposure to it, still going to impact you. And so sometimes people ask, like, well, were the Puritans even drinking? Oh yeah, they're fine with drinking. They're just like against everything else. So it's, you know, and also thinking about this as a time that to have safe drinking water, right, is a real challenge. And so one of the ways to do that is going through a brewing process, even though they didn't necessarily put it together, but drinking brewed beverages was a really normalized part for people of all different ages. Okay. So this is fascinating, and it's captivating to think about it, right? For like an epidemiological stance of this mold that could be impacting these behaviors and impacting how people are experiencing the world. Okay, but challenges to this, because I'm always bummed, because I was like, this I think is like a really interesting, tidy story that explains one relatively small and horrific period of time in a very targeted place. Remember, this is going on across Europe. This is going on across the Northeast, and all of them were not facing an ergot issue. Anyway, so challenges to this. There's no verification of the crop failure. We know that the winter was really bad. We know that the fall was really bad, but there's nothing to indicate that they did have major crop failures. So it's not saying it didn't happen, but we don't have the evidence to indicate that, right? There's also no after effects of ergotism documented. And so I put long ergotism here because, you know, many of us are facing long COVID right now, for instance. We're thinking about these after effects of disease that stick with us. But these tend to include things like, you know, continuing to have these bouts of mania, continuing to have challenges with sensations and that. But the people who were the accusers didn't show that. We don't see that, at least it's not recorded. And it might be that the people who are recording it are really interested in maybe not highlighting those differences, right? Because once they've gone through and murdered half of their community, you know, perhaps they don't want to be like, oh shoot, this is continuing. Also, the symptoms of the girls could be turned on and off. So there are these cases where they'd have, you know, during the trials, the girls who are accusing people of cursing them, they would go into convulsions when the people they're accusing walked into the room, right? They would start screaming like they're on fire, right? So there are things that are going on and off. Okay, so could it be a crossover of the two? Could there be mild poisoning and then also behaviorally that they're acting these ways that they find culturally acceptable, or they're getting energy and attention for doing, they're getting the positive reinforcement from all the adults in their community for? Possibly. Other examples, other possibilities are religious and economic examples. So Salem is divided into Salem Village and Salem Town. And what we see, I don't know if you can see I hope you can see my little pointer here. So this is the town of Salem down here. And then we have, this is Salem Village. And this again, Salem, Massachusetts. And the triangles are the accused. And then the squares are the accusers. So the people, what we see is that the accused tend to be merchants, the merchant class. They tend to be more secular. And some of them are more recent transplants into the area. They would not be able to have the local sticker on the back of their buggy, for instance. Whereas the accusers were mostly farmers, people who lived in farming communities on the other side. So again, that's where those little squares are, if you can see those. And there's a lot documented about how their way of life was threatened. And this also ties in, there's there's some space in there about how there's a certain church and a certain church leader who is trying to get everyone to go to his church, regardless if they were on the merchant or the farmer's side, and there was not agreement to do that. And there's some indications that the people who were the accused were people who are not agreeing to go into this church community. So another example, another reason here, and I think this is might be one of my last reasons I have here that people have talked about, because this is something that, again, Salem witch trials gains a lot of attention and energy, but this stuff's been going on for hundreds of years around this. It's just a one-off example, or a one period example. So this coincides with this thing, the witch trials coincide with cold weather. And actually what we've seen from analyses is that frequently witch accusations, witch trials coincide with particularly terrible winters. So we see that people fall in hard times, they lose crops. There's belief that witches control the weather, right? And then these hard times coincide with accusations, right? So you're losing your crops, your family is dying, your domesticated animals are dying, things are really bad. You want to have someone to blame. And so this is one of the paths for that. So, it could be all these, it could be none of these, these pieces bubble up. And again, if you have a chance to watch my recording on vampires, we talk about that in terms of who gets accused of being a vampire. All up in the same region, by the way. It's a amazing place to be during this time if you're a woman. Okay, so some conclusions, and then I would love to answer any questions you have. Please feel free to throw questions. I know there's a space for Q&A. It's also the chat. I'd love to hear what you're thinking with all this. We know that cultures, so cross-culturally, we use morality stories to maintain behaviors, and the idea of witches and this core component of starting point, but like for instance, utilizing the texts in Genesis of Eve's behavior, helps maintain behaviors and helps indicate why it's appropriate to have certain responses over others. We know that cultures around the globe create meaning from fear, right? You're having a true fear response. You don't know what's going on. You act out in these ways, and you have cultural agreements on how to respond and what's the appropriate way to respond. These are really important things to keep in mind as we continue on and think about our own cultures, our own communities, our own country. Remembering that witch hunts were led by powerful people, not against them. Right. So it was not the powerful people who are being persecuted in this. It was the people who lacked power and the people who were not necessarily staying in line as expected by leaderships. And then we have got these biological and socioeconomic explanations that are used to explain witches. So with this, as you're thinking about this and thinking about, again, as anthropologists, we're really comparative. We love thinking about this cross-culturally. We like call it like holistic approach to thinking about societies and cultures and time and beings, thinking about this and what this looks like for us, right? As contemporary people. And with this, I want you to think about spaces of power and power inequalities and inequities within our own communities. And I urge you to vote. So at the time of recording this, we are about to come up for an election, and we are having early voting, and you can still register to vote. And again, I see all these as very tied together in terms of how we understand and engage with systems and policies. Okay, so with that, I thank you. I appreciate you. I appreciate the Bellamy Mansion for inviting me back again. Please throw questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and let's talk a little bit.
All right, we're back. That was great, fascinating stuff. Thank you for doing that. We do have questions. I've got a few, and I've collected a few. No one, I don't think, has tried ergot in its pure form. They're telling me, but maybe other alkaloids, perhaps. Mm-hmm. You never know.
I don't know.
I think some of the questions were things like, why do you think witches, the image of them would go in and out of sort of popular culture and literature, evil to kind of cuddlier to kind of back and forth, just changing times or something else in thematically?
Oh, do you know what? I would love to know more about this, because I was thinking about it today about how we do have this changing image of witches, right? And we, like you said, it goes from like ugly to like sexy to more fun and our bestie, like you think like Wicked, right? The musical, and really started as a book and then musical, right? And this idea of how we perceive witches. And I think that actually is part of our answer there. Like again, coming back to like Wicked as a book and a musical phenomenon, it's this idea of like how we're thinking about and how we change our view on like who witches are and what witches are. And the other piece of this is that I was looking for pop culture references of Black witches, for instance, that were not racist, and trying to look for these other, like, I've got all these other white pop culture witches. And that's partially because, my lack of knowledge maybe about other piece of pop culture, but also one of like, it says about who we perceive as being a witch. And, the majority of witches that I put up for us at the beginning, they're all like our pals, they're our buddies, they're like, they've got a wink for us to be really, sort of part of their world, and understanding it as these like all the too much women, that we're part of that. But with that, we're also sealing out Black and brown women from that narrative. And I think that's something also to be thinking about and asking questions about too.
Right. That is interesting, because you may have read some of the chat functions, but Tabitha from Bewitched, right? Hermione Granger, Harry Potter.
I'm reading those right now. Yeah. And I'm loving it. But it's like, as I'm very open. If anyone, please send me witches, because I'm going to keep building on this. So send me favorite witches. I'll put up my email in just a moment here.
But then the flip side of that is, Blair Witch Project-y stuff, where it's either a horror movie or like a, I don't know, comedy or something like that. Maybe on the flip side.
Oh man,
it's just an interesting way that it sort of vacillates between the two, often at the same time, right? As well in popular culture, it's got that kind of force. It's as a sort of a mythology, as an image.
Yeah, well, we are taught to fear witches. We are taught to fear witches. We're taught to fear particularly disempowered people who gain power. That is something that we are taught to fear and that we actively push back against, right? And so, seeing, the like Blair Witch Project came out in the 90s, right? That was terrifying. That was a scary engagement, because it was a very different way of filming things, but it was also one of like, what is this? Because it's something outside of our technology and our understanding of the world.
So similar kind of thing, really, because you talk so much about how women and the reasons why it's misogynistic and other things.
Yeah.
But there is somewhere in there, I guess, so the male equivalency, if that is a thing, is that the word warlock or something like this, or usually wizard, right? But that's often seen much more benignly, I think, probably, then I might be wrong about that, in terms of how, your Dumbledores and your Harry Potters and whatnot. But before that, if it even appears, particularly widely in popular culture, is that just more layers, do you think, of misogyny and all the rest of the things you've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting that, I've been reading about is, looking at, because I was like, okay, I'm cautious as a scholar to be like, oh my gosh, it was all women or majority women, and not recognizing what are those experiences of those men, right? That was terrifying for those men. They were facing being hung, more likely than being burnt. Burning at the stake is a much less common thing. Wasting a lot of firewood. I'm not joking. It's like, that's a big waste of resources, whereas hanging someone is not a waste of resources. I'm not making light of it. I want to be very clear. But what I was reading in pieces of this that I'm pulling together is that, again, is the men who are accused are the ones who are associated with witches, but there's also these things of, oh, well, this is a this is a man who has, it's almost like he's somehow like the devil's right hand man, almost like the pimp of witches, if you will, right? There's some like he's still a higher level power than these witches. So even in persecution, your men are higher up than women are. And I don't want to speak too broadly to that because there's only a couple of cases that I read about with that and focused on with that. But it is something to think about. And it is, there's a very different, we think very differently about like wizards, right? If we think about wizards, it's typically these like, we have, I mean, I'm thinking Gandalf in my head, like it's the first one that comes in my head, right? But like wizards are like these grisly old men who are these sage individuals who are just super knowledgeable. They're very frequently in pop culture white. They're just very sagely knowing and maybe a little bit quirky, but we're cool with that. But on the flip side, we demonize women because how dare women get old, am I right? And we demonize older women as being problematic and a challenge, as opposed to like recognizing their power that they bring with them. So no, I think it's such great questions because we're thinking about all the components in this.
So go on from that one. You could be, so a question, David is asking this question. People who identify as witches today, say Wiccans, is that a completely modern phenomenon? Because if you did that historically, I guess I'm adding a little bit, but because historically that would be really, that would get you hurt. That bad things would happen to you. But now, not necessarily so much. It's feels more of a maybe new age is the wrong term, but something like that maybe where it wouldn't. And so people can identify that way because there's just more freedom in society or something like that.
So great question. And actually, I failed at the beginning of this talk because I should have started by saying that as we were talking about witches, we're talking about them in a historical perspective, and we're not talking about Wiccans. We're not talking about contemporary. So we're not talking about Wiccans. We're not talking about pagans. We're not talking about contemporary groups who are practicing witchcraft in multiple forms that we see again around the globe. And so I'm not actually, I hesitate to answer that because I have some understandings of that if it's like a newer phenomenon in terms of like the actual like emergence of the Wiccan craft, for instance. I understand it in its current form. It's newer with roots in very long held traditions and traditions that were really actively stomped out over time by all these systems that we're talking about. But it's the idea, and David, I think this is what you're getting at here, where like you can tell, I don't want to say you can't, it is safer today to tell someone that you are Wiccan or pagan or that you follow these traditions. But I would argue that although there's greater safety than what we've seen in the past, it is still not entirely safe. And that it is still something that people choose whether or not they share that with other people. And that it becomes people are choosing whether or not to share that part of their identity with others. And part of that is because of how society reacts and the idea that it's potentially not fully safe within the community. Practicing in itself is safe, but being recognizing that, there are spaces within fundamental Christianity, for instance, where Christianity can still be seen where, practicing witches can still be seen as very problematic and very much connected to these very literal understandings of the devil. And also globally, I will say that it is absolutely not safe to say that you're a witch. Like there are places where people are still being actively persecuted for witchcraft, and sometimes by the governments, and sometimes by the local communities, like more local governments, but that it is there's definitely more protections in many communities than in the States than in other spaces.
I remember even, all of that. And there was even a backlash, if you recall, for Harry Potter and things like that. There is a sort of a fundamentalist thought on that.
Mhm.
I've got a couple, because I'm bouncing around with the questions, but one that came up, Dion was asking this, and this crossed my mind. You've got the picture on the screen right there. The costuming, right? The sort of classical tall pointy hat, long
Yeah.
flowing hair, hook nose with a wart, broomstick, long flowing black dress, black cat, even other sort of, I guess that's another bad luck mythology that comes into it.
Mhm.
Where do you think all that specifically, if there is a specific moment, came in? It's just the continued use of that imagery, as Dion is saying,
Mhm.
just perpetuates.
Right. So is the question when, so, you talked about it being that the anti-Semitic imagery used to be like, this is the problem person, and that continued anti-Semitism, which is alive and well, right, in both Europe and in the United States. Although I would argue that the majority of people do not understand that the anti-Semitic roots of that costume, and certainly this is a style. We talked about it being tied to Hasidic Jews. This is a style that is out of practice with those communities, right? So there becomes a question then of appropriation, right? And becomes a question of like, okay, this is originated as an anti-Semitic imagery, right? Tying this as being a witch. I mean, this image by itself, right? Or the individual pieces can be like, a celebration of women from that time period, but that's not how we use it. This is something that they'd be wearing this year round, right? And they'd be sweeping year round because they're on their game, right? And taking care of their kitty cats year round, but they are not, this is the only time we bring this out is during Halloween, and the only time we celebrate this imagery. You do not see, I love dressing up, and I'm a big, like 1940s time period, 1920s time period. It's so fun, right? I love history, love engaging with it in terms of fashion. And I just, with all those things and recognizing, people love dressing up in terms of, Renaissance fairs, which are real fast and loose with dates that Renaissance fairs cover, but go for it, enjoy it, love it. But we don't see, that's not a space where typically people are dressed in this outfit to recognize this time period with these people, right? And so it becomes it gives us some thought, it gives us some pause about how do we think about that? How do we engage with that? What does that mean? And what does that look like? So certainly it's made me much more careful about thinking about those images and how I use them.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that until you got into that just now. Jen, do you want to ask something?
I think we answered Dion's in what you just said. So I'm going to go to Gail. So her question from the chat is, what about the old movies of like the witches burning, specifically like in England, especially with nuns and convents were blaming? And then think about like your thoughts on the 15th and 16th century when it comes to that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, let me read this. Gail, this is a really excellent question. I feel like this is an awesome like essay question here for a test. That's a compliment coming from a faculty member. I'm like, yes, okay. Okay, what about old movies? Saying that in England, especially nuns and convents are being because lots of lands, the church wanted to regain that power. So I'm trying to make sure I'm answering this with what it's asking. Okay, so is it saying that nuns and convents were blamed for the burning of witches, or that so it wouldn't be that the nuns were recognized as witches.
It's sort of related, I think, is how it says that the church had a lot of power and therefore there was persecution, or something. Women were picked on in that context, I think.
Oh, okay, I'm going to answer a question, which is not necessarily the question asked. Okay, so what I will share is that we see during this time in Europe, we see that the church and political systems are completely intertwined, right? And we see that power and wealth are linked as they are now, right? And that the way that the church would grow is with the nation growing, right? Like again, absolutely tied together. And that there were land grabs and land claims that were associated directly with different churches and different religious processes. So with that, there is, I don't know necessarily strictly associated with like nuns and convents being blamed, but it wouldn't surprise me, right? And I would say probably, I would say that the convents and the nuns have less power because they are, in terms of the power system of the Catholic Church, they are lower than priests and majority of the leadership, right? So to me, that would be if I had to take a stab at it, then it would be getting orders from other spaces to do this and enacting it and recognizing that this is like, we are doing this for the glory of our God. But what we know throughout history is people do a lot of things for the glory of God that are actually in the glory of serving a human leader as opposed to God Almighty. So it's, again, like I said, I'm answering a question. I don't know that I'm necessarily answering your question, but I'm always happy to learn more if people know more about that.
You could always add that you're going to put up your email at the end of this, right? So
Yeah, let me
people
actually pop that up now as I'm thinking
Yeah.
about it. Okay, and I do want to point out, I'm happy to answer some more questions, but I have my email here on, if you love vintage social media, you can follow what I'm up to on the UNCW Department of Anthropology and the GAPS lab, which is the Growth Adaptation Pregnancy Stress Lab, which is the lab I run. That page is a little quieter right now because we're working on, if you will, brewing up some projects. But it is, that's great ways to keep in touch. If you like the general gist of these topics, those are spaces, and everyone's welcome. Sometimes people are worried about joining the anthropology page. I'm here to tell you that we love anthropologists. We love anthropology adjacent people. We are very much happy to have you all in. And now you all are anthropologically adjacent because you've spent your afternoon hanging out with me. So there you go.
a welcoming crowd, right? I got a couple, just the last two, say something like that, 2 or 3.
Okay.
So Halloween, right? I've got my big silly hat, if I can see it, if it's calendar or whatever, it won't pick it up, doesn't matter. How do all these mythologies, we've got vampires, we've got zombies, we've got all this stuff, seems to come together at Halloween. That seems, we know what All Hallows Eve was and all that, but or many do. When has that become popular, do you think? How did that morph from being a series of persecuted small groups historically and anthropologically, and then over time turns into a giant commercial? I think it's like the biggest commercial event of the year, isn't that, or something, in America?
And yeah, I was gonna say in the United States, like
Yeah.
Britain's just starting to do it, and
Right.
which welcome Britain.
Yeah. What to do?
So
Yeah.
it's fairly recently, right? I mean, even if you're, so I was raised in the 80s. My husband, so I was born in the 80s. My husband was born in the 70s, and like even our costumes are like a little bit different in terms of like what level people are investing, what's available costume wise. So it used to be basically a plastic bag you'd put over your child, and I'm sure some sort of like toxic mask.
Yeah. It's not safe. Don't do that at home.
Yeah, don't do that at home. Oh my gosh. No, but it's indicative of a, it's not a particularly super old tradition in terms of like this very deep event, and the amount of money we spend on it now is just, it is beyond the pale, right? And I say this as someone whose front yard is very, very decorative right now. There's a lot happening out there.
Mine too.
So, I mean, we know that we see, so fall, right? So like obviously we're in, we're in a part of the world that fall happens to occur around September, October. And I'm saying that because remember, in other places of the globe, it's warming up during this time of year for them, right? So our winter is not everybody's winter. And so there's certainly a pattern. So if you're in New Zealand and trying to celebrate Halloween, you're like in the middle of your summer. trying to do this, which leads from much better costumes, I will say, because you aren't worried about it. I digress. So, but we see for those split spaces where fall does actually land within that August, September, October, that's your fall, that's your harvest season. We see a long tradition of harvest festivals and harvest celebrations and this transition. I mean, you're harvesting is you're putting in all this food and you're canning it and you're putting it up for the winter and you're preparing for it. You're like it's a celebration for recognizing dark days are to come. We see, Yule being celebrated, and us going to another holiday, but like Yule recognizing this transition of days from the darker to the lighter days, right? These are all squarely within, coming back to like pagan traditions of celebrating these time shifts and these periods and of our seasons shifting as we recognize them shifting our part. And then of course we can think about things like Day of the Dead, right, which have a strong tradition and the idea of like All Hallows Eve and this shift in terms of when the veil is lifted between the living and those who have deceased, and so all of these pieces have been around and have a really thick tradition, and it is just we're happening to really turn up the volume in terms of how much we put into it in terms of costume wise or decorating and all that for this period. But certainly celebrating in terms of fall festivities is very far from being a new thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I got one more on here, and that's Jen. Do you have any more? Or I've got one more on the Q&A.
That was just the last one on the Q&A.
Yeah, Tammy is asking this, and it's more of the modern Wicca sort of question. Wicca and Hoodoo, I guess that is, seem to have a racially segregated witches and witchcraft and that thing in the modern context, along racial lines, and how they practice and spiritual beliefs differ. One is European-based, the other African. And there's a lot of cultural appropriation dialogue ongoing about the modern practice and whether these practices or religions should stay segregated. That's a kind of I've not thought about.
Great question.
It is.
What culture about modern practices? One of these practices, yeah. Okay, no, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the European witchcraft and this idea of this comparison between like hoodoo and European witchcraft and these different cultural traditions and what that looks like. I've definitely heard about those discussions and conversation about like the conversations surrounding cultural appropriation. And of course, a cultural appropriation is occurring when individuals who have less power, their traditions and beliefs they're persecuted for them, or they're held to a lower standard because of those expressions, traditions, but someone taking it up who is from a more empowered society, that they get the benefits of it. So it's like fun and charming when people in a more powerful society take it up, but it's seen as problematic when someone from a less powerful community is doing it. So there's certainly is conversations about that crossover. I do not know enough about either of them to talk about where that crossover is and what is like where the tie, like not where the ties are exactly, but like what's already shared between those communities and what's being culturally appropriated. And I so definitely leave that in the space of people who have greater expertise than me, but it's really important to be thinking about again, as we're moving through and thinking about pluralistic understanding of how people engage with their spaces and religious practices and that kind of thing, and being mindful that as we're in these different spaces that we're not just absolutely taking from other cultures and communities in a way that disempowers them. Great questions. I love how y'all are thinking. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for all hanging out with me this afternoon. And again, please go vote. Go vote, go get your friends to vote. You can still register to vote. And then also like I just want to thank the Bellamy team again for inviting me back. This is always just a really great tradition and a great celebration. And know that anthropology is open to everyone. If you're already a student at UNCW, come take classes with me. And if you are a community member, please feel free to come take our classes as well. I think if you're 50 plus, you get classes for free. So you can come take my classes. So, all right, thank y'all.
Thank you so much again for doing it. Everybody enjoy Halloween, and now you've learned a lot about it. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.